Welcome everyone. I'm Professor John Howe, the Director of the Melbourne School of Government, and on behalf of the Melbourne School of Government, it's a pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the book launch of Randomistas, How Radical Research Has Changed Our World by Andrew Leigh. We meet today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. I do just want to note that this evening's proceedings are being recorded and will be available from our website soon, and this event is also being photographed, so if you're not comfortable with this, please let the event photographer know. And she's taking a photo there now, and I'm happy to be photographed. I also ask that you please take a moment to either switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent for the duration of the event. I'm very pleased that the Melbourne School of Government is hosting the launch of Andrew's new book. One of the school's priorities is to contribute to public debate and have real-world impact on troubling public policy issues. As a former academic turned politician, Andrew is a testament to the productive relationship between research and policy, and his new book tells stories about researchers, radical researchers as he calls them, who impacted on both policy and its implementation. I'd now like to introduce Professor Jeff Borland, who will be launching this book tonight. Jeff Borland is Truby Williams Professor of Economics here at the University of Melbourne. His main research interests are analysis of the operation of labour markets in Australia, program and policy evaluation design, Australian economic history and sports economics. He's been awarded the Australian Academy of Social Sciences Medal for Excellence in Scholarship in the Social Sciences, and since 2002 he's been a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He teaches currently in the areas of microeconomics, sports economics and Australian and world economic history, and he's acted as a consultant on labour market and microeconomics issues to organisations such as the OECD, IMF, ACCC, New Zealand Treasury and the Productivity Commission. So please welcome Jeff Borland.
So yeah, I'd like to begin as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event's taking place and their elders past and present. So it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Andrew Leigh back to the University of Melbourne. Andrew is the MHR for Fenner in the Commonwealth Parliament and Shadow Assistant Treasurer. Some of you who watch the TV news might have also picked up that he has another role. That's as the Canberra running partner for Bill Shorten. Every now and then, the media, it's either the media or the Labor Party, decide that they want to do an interview with Bill while he's running. And if you watch those episodes, I've found that you usually see Andrew standing deferentially a couple of metres behind Bill as he does the interview. Why do I say deferentially? Well, some of you may know that a few years ago, Andrew took up marathon running. And the last time I talked to him about this, Andrew's best time in the marathon was 2 hours 42 minutes. Now some of you may know about marathon running and know that that's pretty impressive for someone in their early 40s to be running that sort of time. I thought some of you might need a translation. I was going to do this in a rough sort of way, but then I knew that if I did that, Andrew would know exactly what the answer was. So the next part of my talk is actually based on research. I asked one of my friends who's a professor of sports medicine at UBC, if someone ran 2:42 in their early 40s, what would their time have been at their peak? And he gave me 3 websites to look at, which told me that Andrew's time would have been between 2 hours 30 and 2 hours 33. If you look at the Australian Marathon Championships, which were held in Sydney last year, a time of 2:33 would have put Andrew 11th in the men's category. So you can see, well, if you form the same opinion from watching TV of Bill Shorten's running talent as I have, you'll know why I use the word deferentially. But it's not Andrew the politician or runner who we're welcoming here tonight. It's Andrew Leigh, the public intellectual. Those of you who, like me, are academics won't be at all surprised to know that since Andrew moved from academia to being a politician, he's had a lot more spare time. And he's been able to use that spare time very productively. In the last 5 years, he's published 5 books. Battlers and Billionaires, The Economics of Just About Everything, The Luck of Politics, Choosing Openness, and now Randomistas. Those books are making a major contribution to public discourse in Australia. In Battlers and Billionaires, Andrew made a highly influential contribution to the ongoing discussion on inequality in Australia, and I think there's no doubt it's the best general survey on that topic that we've had in Australia. In Choosing Openness, Andrew, a book he published last year, Andrew's provided a comprehensive, scholarly and powerful, balanced account of why Australia should remain open to trade, migration and capital flows. Now Andrew's presented us with Randomistas. Being asked to launch Randomistas did give me some moments of introspection. I guess haven't been asked to launch a book before. I understood enough to know that my objective is to have you all running for the exits after this session to buy a copy of the book. I see some of you have done that already, which is great, because I think running to the exits to buy a copy of the book is exactly what you should be doing. But I was still wondering, well, how should I convince you to do that? And that's where the introspection came in. I guess I thought about a process I've done probably hundreds, maybe thousands of times, but never really thought about, which is, what do I think about when I buy a book? And I decided there were probably 3 things that I think about. The first thing I think about is the topic. Is the topic something that I'm going to be interested in reading about? Secondly, the author. Is the author someone who I think is going to have something worthwhile to say about this topic? And if a book passes those 2 tests, then if I'm somewhere at a bookshop where you can look at the physical book, probably I'll flick through the book a little bit more, and I'll think about things like, do the contents match what I expected? Does the book seem well written? Does it seem well researched? Does it add value to compare to other books that I've read on that topic? So I decided that what I'd try and do is give you a perspective in terms of those 3 questions that I ask when I think about buying a book. So first of all, the topic. So I assume that everyone here tonight is here because they're interested in a way in the topic of good policy making. And if that's the case, then it's undoubted that you'll find the topic of Randomistas interesting and important. So I guess we all think that better policy making relies on improved evidence. And RCTs, as you'll no doubt know, long applied in fields such as medicine, are increasingly being applied in a whole lot of other fields such as social policy, education, business decision making and philanthropy. So the book's about a topic that's important and only getting more important in Australia and other countries. So secondly, the author. Well, that's easy to address as well. So since he returned to Australia in the early 2000s, I like to think of Andrew as Australia's ambassador for randomisation. He's been a consistent and strong advocate and influential advocate for the greater use of RCTs to evaluate policy in Australia. And he's done a broad array of research using RCTs. He did a field experiment looking at the effect of discrimination or investigating discrimination against minorities in hiring in Australia. And he's done a whole lot of research that's known as sort of quasi-experimental, doing things like looking at using the gun buyback to look at the impact of availability of guns on firearm deaths, using school zones to look at the effect of neighbourhood amenity on house prices. Most famously, I guess, he looked at the impact of the 2004 baby bonus and the 1979 abolition of death duties. You may know that he found that by comparing sort of the pattern of births before and after July 1st, in the year in which the baby bonus was introduced, to the previous 29 years, he and his co-author Josh Gans were able to conclude that about 1,000 births were shifted from the week before the baby bonus to the week after. Now that's kind of understandable, because as they show, you can understand most of that through delayed induced births and delayed caesareans. The study that's always puzzled me is the study that Andrew and Josh did, where they showed that the abolition of, using a similar methodology, the abolition of death duties in Australia in 1979 appeared to have shifted 50 deaths from before the abolition to after. And I always wonder, how could that happen? Like, is it maybe the son and daughter-in-law go around with the grandkids, go around to the house and they say, gee, Dad, yeah, Grandpa, he's not moving, sort of, and that, and so that's okay, he's just asleep. We'll come back. We'll come back in a couple of days after July 1st and check him out. And then you go, well, what do you know when they come back? So it's also worthwhile saying that the campaigning that Andrew has done for more RCTs in Australia is really starting to pay off. So most state governments in Australia have now started nudge units to undertake randomised controlled trials of behavioural type policies. Prime Minister and Cabinet has established beta. Department of Social Security has started a new initiative, Try, Test, Learn, which, while not completely about randomised trials, is certainly a move in the right direction. Okay, the third thing is the details of the book. So Andrew faced a bit of a challenge in writing this book, I think. Most of his previous books have had a focus on Australia, but if he'd written a book about randomised control trials focusing on social policy, other related types of policies in Australia, it would have become his shortest book. So Andrew's done something that I think, in fact, is much more wide-ranging and ultimately much more valuable in this book. He's written what I think is, and I say this comparing across all the books that I know of internationally at the moment on RCTs, the best and most comprehensive introduction to the way RCTs are being used around the world in the fields where they matter: medicine, development economics, social policy, education, business, politics and philanthropy. And at the same time, he's given particular emphasis to Australian examples of RCTs. So I think he's done a great service to people in Australia. I'm a bit biased because I guess I'm one of these people who are doing RCTs, because he's created an international audience for his book, but he's really showcasing some of the RCTs that are happening in Australia. So in Andrew's book, you'll learn about a whole lot of things, many of which I didn't know about. Sham surgery. This is very interesting. You should read the book to find out about that. How 1,000 research studies on learning have been based on Sesame Street. How microcredit in poor countries, often sort of seen as a panacea in developing countries, probably isn't all it's cracked up to be. Whether to wear compression socks after running a marathon. How to experiment on Google to work out what the best title for your book is, and whether deep canvassing works, as well as some really interesting Australian trials like Journeys to Social Inclusion and the Head Injury Retrieval Trial. Andrew uses these examples to make what I think is really his main argument for RCTs, that without evaluation we can never really know the impact of a policy or program. And Andrew has a fantastic quote in the book when he says that the real value of RCTs is when they surprise us. And the fact that Andrew is able to provide in the book so many examples of RCTs that have surprised us is really the kind of compelling demonstration of their value, and more generally of the importance in bringing evidence to bear in policy making. As well as learning about the research studies, you'll learn about some of the fascinating pioneers and characters of RCT history. Some of these people be familiar to you, I guess. Archie Cochrane, Judith Guerin, Esther Duflo and Frances Kelsey. And you'll also learn plenty about the method of RCT. So Andrew spends time talking about how to go about doing an RCT in a way that means you're going to get sensible, valid results from it, ways to overcome potential objections people might make to doing RCTs, and problems and pitfalls with doing RCTs. So it's a story, it's a storybook, but a storybook that you'll learn heaps from. I knew a bit about RCTs from being involved in them already before I read the book, and I guess I was already a convert, but I certainly learnt lots from it. In addition to just enjoying seeing the story of RCTs put together so skillfully and finding out about lots of research studies I didn't know about, one big lesson that I felt I learned from the book was, I guess I'd always felt about RCTs that, well, RCTs are really great, but, you know, the circumstances have got to be right. Maybe the situation when you can apply them is a little bit narrow or limited. I think the examples Andrew's provided in the book have really made me rethink that and think that I was wrong to think of them as being so limited in their application. That the examples Andrew provides really make sort of a strong case that with a creative approach, approach and hard thinking, there's a much wider range of ways in which you can apply RCTs than you might think possible. And one example, which is particularly sort of nice, is Andrew's example of parachute experiments. I guess Andrew talks about how people have often said, well, you couldn't do an RCT of whether you should use a parachute jumping out of a plane. And Andrew acknowledges that that's probably right. You probably wouldn't want to do an RCT of that. But he goes on to list about 5 or 6 ways in which people have done really interesting randomised control studies to do with jumping out of aeroplanes with parachutes. For example, you know, whether you want to do it with ankle braces or not ankle braces and things like that. So that's kind of one neat illustration of that point. There's 2 final things to say about the book. One is that it's incredibly well researched. If you've bought it and flicked through the list of references already, you see that Andrew's roamed far and wide and really discovered a treasure trove of academic and government studies that are the basis of the book. So this is a really solid, rigorous look at what we know about RCTs at the moment. The other thing to say about the book is that it's wonderfully written. The book's engaging and fluent throughout, and it's written for a general audience. So I think anyone interested in public policy, whatever your background, is going to be able to read and take away a huge amount from this book. So in the end, this book, I think, is about making a case for the value and for why we should make greater use of RCTs. And those of us with a commitment to improving evidence for decision making should, I think, feel greatly indebted to Andrew for having made that case in Randomistas in such an entertaining, wide-ranging and compelling way. So it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew.
Thank you very much. Can I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, to thank Professor John Howe, Dorothy Luck, who's put together tonight's event, my editor Chris Feek, probably the best wordsmith in the nation, my aunts Charmian and Gabriel, who are here tonight, one of my predecessors as member for then Fraser, John Langmore, Randomista Philip Clark, many former academic colleagues. I spent a few glorious months visiting Melbourne University and very much enjoyed building up those relationships here, and all of you for taking time on a beautiful Melbourne night to come out and talk about randomised trials and good public policy. In 2013, a group of Finnish doctors published the results of a randomised trial on knee surgery performed for a torn meniscus, the piece of cartilage that provides a cushion between the thigh bone and the shin bone. The operation, known as a meniscectomy, is performed millions of times a year. making it the most common orthopaedic procedure in countries like Australia and the United States. The randomised trial was based on sham surgery, in which patients consent to being assigned either to a regular treatment or to being cut open and sewn up again without the operation being performed. Not only is the patient assigned to true surgery or placebo surgery based on the toss of a coin, they're not even told afterwards what happened to them. The 2013 randomised experiment shows that among middle-aged patients, surgery for a torn meniscus was no more effective than sham surgery. Not everyone welcomed the finding. An editorial in the journal Arthroscopy thundered that sham surgery randomised trials were ludicrous. The editors went so far as to argue that because no right-minded patients would participate in sham surgeries, the results were not generalisable to mentally healthy patients. But sham surgeries are growing in importance, as many people realise that the placebo effect in surgery may be bigger than in any other area of medicine. A recent study found that 3/4 of patients say they feel better after surgery. But in half the cases, those who got the sham surgery get a similarly big improvement as those who got the real surgery. And that result suggests that millions of people every year are undergoing surgeries that make them feel better, but that they would get just as good a boost if they got placebo surgery instead. Despite the advocacy of surgeons such as Melbourne's Peter Shung, sham surgery remains in its infancy. Part of the challenge comes down to how surgeons approach their job. Sydney surgeon Ian Harris says, patients often regard aggressive surgeons as heroic and conservative surgeons as cowardly. So what does a typical randomised trial look like? Let's suppose we wanted to know the impact of sleep on happiness by doing an experiment with the 100 or so people in the room. If we tossed coins, we'd end up with 50 people in the heads group and 50 people in the tails group. We might then ask the heads group to get an extra hour sleep tonight. And tomorrow morning, we would survey everyone as to their happiness levels, and if we found that those for whom the coin came up heads were happier, we might well conclude that a little more snooze helps you lose the blues. The beauty of a randomised trial is that it helps you get around problems that might otherwise plague an observational study, such as the possibility of reverse causality, that perhaps happier people tend to hit the hay a little earlier. Randomised trials have a long history in medicine, going back to James Linn's work on scurvy, Ambrose Paré's work on treating battlefield burns, whether it was better to pour water with little rose oil or burning oil onto a burn. In the 1800s, a randomised trial showed that bloodletting didn't in fact cure patients, a result that came just a little too late for the discipline which had already decided to call one of its leading journals The Lancet. In the 1940s, British researcher Austin Bradford Hill was working on streptomycin, a promising new treatment for tuberculosis. The disease had nearly killed Hill as a child, and still at that time claimed the lives of nearly 200,000 Britons annually. Hill used scarcity as an argument for conducting a randomised trial of streptomycin, rather than just rolling it out across the country. He said we had no dollars, and the amount we were allowed by the British Treasury was only enough for, so to speak, a handful of patients. In that situation, I said that it would be unethical not to conduct a randomised trial. A trial in 1954 randomly injected 600,000 US children with either polio vaccine or salt water. The vaccine proved more effective than the salt water, and universal vaccination for polio began the following year. The 1960s saw randomised trials used to test drugs for diabetes and blood pressure and the contraceptive pill. And in between, there's been plenty of randomised trials for ineffective treatments. Today, only 1 in 10 treatments that looks promising ends up finding its way through the 3 stages of randomised trials and onto the market. In each case, those taking the new drug are compared against people taking a fake drug or placebo. For alleviating discomfort, the placebo effect works in surprising ways. For example, placebo injections produce a larger effect than placebo pills. Thanks to randomised trials, we know that if you want to reduce depression, you should give the patient a yellow tablet. For reducing pain, use a white pill. For lowering anxiety, use a green one. Sedatives work best when delivered in blue pills, while stimulants are most effective as red pills. The makers of the Matrix clearly understood this when they devised a moment for their hero to choose between a blue pill and a red pill. And for my own part, randomised trials have shaped how I live my life. I used to take a daily multivitamin pill until I read a meta-analysis of randomised trials suggesting that, if anything, multivitamin supplements reduced longevity. Not wanting to send myself to an early grave, I stopped taking them. Likewise for fish oil. As Jeff's noted, I'm currently wearing compression socks as a result of the randomised trial that showed that among Australian marathon runners, compression socks aid recovery. And whenever I remove one of my 3 sons' band-aids, I'll do so quickly rather than slowly, as a result of the James Cook University randomised trial that showed that the fast approach is less painful than the slow approach. And the Randomistas are shaping social policy too. In Melbourne, the Journey to Social Inclusion experiment was our first randomised trial of a homelessness program. The intervention lasted for 3 years and provided the 40 people in the treatment group with intensive support from a social worker. That caseworker helped them find housing, reconnect with family, access job training. Another 40 people in the control group didn't receive any additional support. So what do they find? Well, if you're like me, you might have assumed that 3 years of intensive support would see all participants happy, healthy and employed. But by and large, that's not what the program found. Those who were randomly selected into the program were indeed more likely to have housing and less likely to be in physical pain. But Journey to Social Inclusion had no impact on reducing drug use or improving mental health. At the end of the 3 years, 2 people out of the 40 in the treatment group had jobs, the same number as in the control group. Journey to Social Inclusion is a reminder of how hard it is to turn around the living standards of the most disadvantaged. Hollywood loves to depict overnight transformations, but the truth, when you're dealing with people who've suffered deep trauma, is that recovery is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And unless we properly evaluate programs designed to help the long-term homeless, there's a risk that people of goodwill, social workers, public servants, philanthropists, will fall into the trap of thinking it's easier than it really is to change lives. Sure, there's plenty of evaluations of Australian homelessness programs that have produced bigger results than this one. But because none of those evaluations was as rigorously conducted as this one, there's a good chance they're overstating their effects. In Canberra, we did world-leading randomised trials of restorative justice conferencing, bringing offender and victim together to discuss what the perpetrator should do to repair the harm they've caused. Cases judged suitable for restorative justice are randomly allocated to it or to the traditional criminal justice process. Studies in Australia and around the world conclude not only that restorative justice reduces crime, but also that it helps victims. In one study, victims of violence were asked whether they would harm the offender if they got the chance. When cases went to court, nearly half the victims said afterwards they still wanted to take revenge, compared to just 1 in 10 who'd gone through restorative justice. And just imagine if we could randomly trial the impact of prisons. Just imagine if there was a prison authority somewhere in the world agreeing to run an experiment to answer the question. Then again, it's a crazy thought. I mean, here we are in a law school recognising the principle of equal justice, and there's no way you can imagine a prison authority conducting a randomised trial of incarceration. Or so you might think. In 1970, the California Parole Board actually agreed to run a randomised experiment. 3,000 prisoners coming up for release were divided into two groups. Using a random table of numbers, half had their sentences shortened by 6 months, and the other half served their regular term. After release, authorities looked to see who reoffended and found no difference between the two groups, suggesting that the additional 6 months behind bars did nothing to make the streets safer. We're learning a lot in the classroom from randomised trials. In one experiment, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation conducted a randomised trial of coaching programs for teachers. Each month, teachers sent videos of their lessons to an expert coach who worked with them to try and eliminate bad habits and try new techniques. By the end of the year, teachers randomly selected into the Gates Foundation's coaching program had gains in their classroom equivalent to several months of learning. Another study looked at the Promise Academy, a school in Harlem that operates on a no excuses model, classes sometimes running as long as 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Across the United States, the average African American student is 2 to 4 years behind his or her white counterpart. But the Promise Academy found that students that won a lottery improved their performance by enough to close the black-white test score gap. As lead researcher Roland Fryer pointed out after the results of the Promise Academy's randomised trial were released, this overturns the fatalistic view that poverty is entrenched and the view that schools are incapable of making a difference. He argues that achievements for the Harlem Children's Zone are the equivalent of curing cancer for those kids. Developing countries are awash with randomised trials. In Indonesia, a randomised trial tested the impact on students of randomly doubling teachers' pay. In India, a randomised trial of 19 million people estimated the impact on corruption of the rollout of biometrically identified smart cards. When the Mexican city of Ayucan found that the council had only enough money to pave about half the streets, the mayor saw an opportunity to assuage voter anger and learn about the impacts of road paving. Rather than selecting the roads herself, she worked with researchers to randomly choose which streets to upgrade. In Kenya, economists worked with the national electricity utility to randomly give some households a discount on the connection fee. And by varying the subsidy, they could see how much households valued being connected to the grid. Businesses too are working on randomised trials. Quora, a question and answer website, devotes about 1/10 of its staff to running randomised trials and is conducting about 30 experiments at any given time. Amazon's virtually built on randomised trials, and indeed, as one observer puts it, virtually every pixel on the Amazon homepage has had to justify its existence based on randomised trials. In retail, if you're wondering why about half of all posted prices end in 9, you can blame marketing randomised trials. If you have a Coles flyby card, you're part of a randomised trial. 1 in 100 cards is randomly selected to be part of a control group, which receives no promotional material. When the board wants to know the impact of their promotional material, they have a randomly selected control group. The shade of blue on the Google toolbar is the result of a randomised trial conducted by Marissa Mayer, then a vice president at Google. She proposed an experiment that tested 40 different shades of blue. And with billions of clicks, even a small difference means big bucks. Google estimates that getting the precisely right shade of blue added about $200 million to the company's bottom line. Google scientists have access to around 15 exabytes of data and around 40,000 searches every second. And that suggests that big data is not an alternative to randomised trials. If Google gets value from randomised experiments, the same must be true for every other researcher on the planet. Running a randomised experiment in business is often called A/B testing and has become integral to the operation of firms such as Netflix, eBay, Intuit, Humana, Chrysler and Lyft. One US executive in a firm that does plenty of randomised trials says that his firm has 3 cardinal rules. You don't steal, you don't harass women, and you've got to have a control group. That's right, you can be fired for not having a control group. You can even use randomised trials in your own life. Last year I used Google Ads to run a small experiment of my own. Anyone who searched the web might have seen an ad for a new book about randomised trials. Web surfers were randomly shown one of 12 possible book titles. My editors and I each had our favourite titles, but we'd agreed to leave the final decision to a randomised experiment. A week later, over 4,000 people had seen one of the advertisements. The worst performing title, by which I mean not a single person clicked on it, was Randomistas: How a Powerful Tool Changed Our World. Runner-up was Randomistas: The Secret Power of Experiments. The clear winner, Randomistas: How Radical Researchers Changed Our World. The experiment took about an hour to set up, cost me about $50. A few years earlier, I'd written a book on inequality for the same publisher. My editor, Chris Feek, who is here this evening, wanted to call it Fair Enough. My mother suggested Battlers and Billionaires. After running Google Ads for a few days, we found the click rate for my mother's title was about 3 times higher. Chris Feek graciously concluded that the evidence was in, and Battlers and Billionaires hit the shelves the following year. And just to show that randomisation can be implemented on the spot, I'm pleased to say I've done a randomised trial to allocate a sought-after product, a free copy of my book. Putting tonight's RSVP list into Excel, I assigned each of you a random number, then sorted the sheet by those numbers. So congratulations to Emily O'Connell and Alex McLaren. Please come down afterwards to get your free copy of the book. All I ask in return is that you might mention it on social media. In the early 2000s, successful businessman Blake McCoskey visited villages outside Buenos Aires and was struck by what he saw. He said, "I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that poor children around the world often went barefoot. But now, for the first time, I saw the real effects of being shoeless. The blisters, the sores, the infections." To provide shoes to these children, McCoskey founded Shoes for Better Tomorrows, which was soon shortened to TOMS. The company made customers a one-for-one promise. Buy a pair of shoes and TOMS will donate a pair to a needy child. TOMS has given away more than 60 million pairs of shoes. 6 years in, McCoskey and his team wanted to know what impact TOMS was having. So they made the brave decision to let economists randomise shoe distribution across 18 communities in El Salvador. The study showed that the canvas loafers they were giving away didn't go to waste. Most children wore their new shoes most of the time. But the children's health wasn't any better, as the TOMS shoes were generally replacing older footwear. Free shoes didn't improve the children's self-esteem, but it did make them feel more dependent on outsiders. Let's be clear about what this meant. Corporate philanthropy wasn't an add-on for TOMS. It was the reason that McCoskey founded the firm. And now a randomised trial had shown that among children in El Salvador, free shoes were not doing much to improve children's outcomes, but were fostering a sense of dependency. Yet rather than trying to discredit the evaluation, TOMS responded promptly. As lead researcher, economist Bruce Wydick wrote, "TOMS is perhaps the most nimble organisation any of us has ever worked with. An organisation that truly cares about what it's doing, seeks evidence-based results on its program, and is committed to reorienting the nature of its intervention in order to maximise results. In response to children saying that the canvas loafer isn't their first choice, they now give away sports shoes. In response to the dependency issue, they now want to pursue giving the shoes to kids as a reward for school attendance and performance. Never once as researchers did we feel a pressure to hide results that could shed an unfavourable light on the company. We applaud them for their transparency and commitment to evidence-based action among the poor." No one should fault Blake McCoskey for setting up TOMS Shoes, acting based on the best available evidence at the time. As W.H. Auden once put it, "We may not know very much, but we do know something. And while we must always be prepared to change our minds, we must act as best we can in the light of what we do know." But when the new evidence arrived, TOMS shifted. And because of that, the TOMS randomised trial doesn't look like a failure at all. Blake McCoskey's goal in establishing TOMS was to improve the health of poor children. The company evaluated its approach, it didn't work, so it changed tack. The philosophy of test, learn, adapt is at the heart of randomisation. Randomised trials flourish where modesty meets numeracy. An experimenting society doesn't just mean we do more rigorous evaluation, it also means we pay attention to the result. Randomisation is changing the world in medicine, in business, social policy, and potentially even in our own life. A few more coin tosses, anyone? Thanks very much.